From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Welcome to Chicago Newsroom. I'm Eitan Michaeli from We the People Media, filling in for Ken Davis. This week, our guest is Glenn Reedus, a veteran of the black press. Let's begin. Glenn, thanks for joining us. We're going to do today a political census of the south side of Chicago, which is, I think, and I imagine you'll agree with me, the most important part of the city when it comes to the upcoming citywide elections in which Mayor Rahm Emanuel is seeking re-election against a host of challengers. But before we get to the citywide race, let's set the stage a little bit and talk about some of the items that have come across the newswire in the last couple of weeks. First of all, let's begin with the departure of Governor Pat Quinn and some of the moves that he made just before he left office. In particular, I want to talk about the commutation of Howard Morgan, a former Chicago police officer who was shot 28 times in a confrontation with current Chicago police officers, who was sentenced to 40 years, and right. You're going to correct me if I get any of these
okay, go ahead.
items wrong. But
you're doing fine so
okay,
far.
Good. But Mr. Morgan, a former Chicago police officer, was working for the Burlington Northern train line as a police officer, was shot in a confrontation with Chicago police officers 28 times, but lived, and Governor Quinn commuted the sentence that he faced for that confrontation. Tell us a little bit about that and why that's a big deal. Why is the South Side paying attention to Howard Morgan?
Well, I don't think it's just the South Side. I think it's actually big chunks of the country, because this was just an incredible injustice. The man was, what, a half a block away from his home. It wasn't like he was roaming the streets at 3 a.m. He was reportedly identified himself as a working policeman, and to be shot 28 times and then you're accused of being the perpetrator? I mean, it didn't make sense. Mr. Morgan's story just, at first, of course, resonated on the South Side, but then throughout the city, and it just kept spreading. Governor Quinn certainly did the right thing. He just took too long to do it. Mr. Morgan should have, by the time he got out of the hospital, he should have been sent home, never to prison.
Do you think, I think the Howard Morgan case, and again, correct me if I'm making an error here, but I did not see regular coverage in the so-called mainstream media in Chicago about Howard Morgan's case. I saw the occasional story in the Sun-Times. I don't recall even seeing anything at all in the Tribune. Maybe there were a few smaller articles. And I remember that the Sun-Times ran a piece in the fall that was actually authored by one of the police officers that was engaged in the confrontation with Mr. Morgan. As I see it, Howard Morgan's case was kept alive by his wife and by a small group of African-American journalists on the South Side who really made it, who kept the issue on the agenda. Is that a fair assessment, do you think?
It is, and
you were one of those folks that was keeping the story alive, I should say.
We tried. I think, too, you have to give a lot of credit to the final call and Richard Muhammad, because this was the kind of story, the kind of case Richard picked up. He ran with it. Of course, the final call is a national newspaper. It just happens to be based in Chicago. Mm-hmm. I think that helped the world, or the rest of the country, find out about the injustice of Howard Morgan.
And do you think that if those guys had, Richard and other folks, yourself and the other folks had kind of eased off, do you think that Governor Quinn would have made this commutation, had issued this commutation?
I do, because there was a huge amount of community pressure on the governor, especially as after the election, when it became apparent he wouldn't be around for this year and beyond. So I think it was as much the community pressure as it was the pressure of the Chicago Crusader, Chicago Defender, and a couple of others.
Well, I think it's people are often quick to dismiss the black press, and I paid attention to this case as one in which I count it as a victory for the black press, one of many, of course.
Definitely.
But to me, it's I was surprised when Governor Quinn made the order for the commutation, and I was wondering. I wanted to ask you really if does this move make up for some of Governor Quinn's missteps? Do you think? No, it does not.
No.
Let's enumerate those missteps for the moment. Do you think that that Governor Quinn, the last 4 years as governor, did he do? Was he a good governor for the South Side and the other parts of the city that needed help from him?
I think he did the best he could. Let's give the political answer.
Sure.
The best he knew how. I don't think he was listening to the right people, or he had the right people around him to do better. I mean, when you mentioned the South Side, but I grew up on the West Side, so it's always near and dear to my heart.
And let me not ignore the West Side.
Okay, but when you look at the parts of the West Side that were affected by the riots in '67, and some of those are still barren. There's huge opportunities for economic development on the West Side that the governor could have impacted, but chose not to. Education, despite the Chicago Board of Education and the mayor and the superintendent of schools, education is in great need of repair in Chicago. The governor could have done some more, particularly in terms of funding for our schools, but it didn't happen.
I see. So, okay, so if the question is, did Governor Quinn rehabilitate his political image with the African American community, your answer is no, he did not by these commutations.
No, he did not.
Okay.
When Governor Ryan stopped the death penalty, whatever sins he had committed against the black community were absolved.
Uh-huh.
And I mean, it takes something huge like that. And no disrespect to the Morgan family or anybody associated with that, but we're talking about an individual, a huge injustice, but not hundreds of people, as was the case with ending the death penalty.
Got it. Let's move on to the new governor, Bruce Rauner, Republican of Wilmette, who has taken office and made a number of moves right away to replace Quinn appointees, to change some of Quinn's executive orders. And one of the more interesting appointments that he's made has been the Reverend James Meeks as the chairman of the State of Illinois Board of Education. How do you read the appointment of Reverend Meeks, who has a history as a Democrat, was a Democratic state senator after all for many years, and was closely aligned with Jesse Jackson and Operation Push? Is this a switch? Has Governor Meeks converted? I'm sorry, has Governor Rauner converted Reverend Meeks into a Republican? What's going on here?
Well, a lot of times in Illinois, it's tough to tell the difference in the Republicans and the Democrats. I don't know about a conversion, but I think that in exchange for his support, Meeks got what he wanted, and that's something to do with education. He took a beating, a verbal beating throughout the campaign for supporting Rauner, and he, surprisingly, he had to defend himself on several occasions for what was his choice. I think, though, that a big problem we're looking at here is one of understanding and interpretation. What Meeks can do on the state board, I think, is being perceived as being a lot more than he can actually do. I point to Gary Chico. Gary lost the mayoral election. He became the chairman of the state board, and essentially we did not hear from him anymore until he endorsed a candidate, and it wasn't Chuy Garcia. But and there are 4 or 5 other members on the state board, so I don't think Meeks will be doing anything alone. I think that unless he tries to reshape the direction and the scope of that board, it's likely that we probably won't hear from him again unless he wants to get back into the political life.
So this is more of a kind of cosmetic move, you think, than a substantial one.
Yes, I would agree 100%.
Now that said, of course, Republican support in the Republicans seeking support in the African American community is nothing new. Governor Jim Edgar, I remember once many years ago, told me that the 20% of the African American community that he was able to get support from was his margin of victory in several elections. And he felt that it was a mistake for Republicans not to reach out to the African American community. But we haven't really seen that. I remember Bill Brady, the previous Republican nominee for governor, made no effort whatsoever in the African American community. Rauner did make an effort, but the numbers don't show that. How should we interpret that in terms of electoral futures? Could we see a percentage of the African American community going for Rauner in a re-election bid because of the appointment of Reverend Meeks? Is that something that you think, is that why Rauner made this move? Is that?
I don't think that single appointment is enough. Right now, Rauner, in my opinion, is the equivalent of the Wizard of Oz. You know, he's the Wizard of Illinois, because even though the curtain's been pulled back, no one really knows what he's going to do. Mm-hmm. If he can somehow fix this budget situation and all ships rise with that tide, then he's got a chance at re-election, doing favorably well in the black community. But otherwise, I don't think so. But there seems to be a growing, more visible Republican presence in the African American community. But this reaching out to black folks, not pandering, but legitimately reaching out, goes all the way back to President Reagan, when the National Republican Committee put up $25 million to attract black voters. But if you've got a bunch of white suburbanites putting together the plan, doing the outreach, you know, you're not going to have the impact,
sure.
the impact that you wanted to get. You know, Rauner had some good surrogates from the black community, including Willie Wilson, who's currently running for mayor. He had Meeks, Hermine Hartman was among them. So just those three. And I think maybe one of Marshall Hatch on the west side.
Corey Brooks as well.
Yeah, yeah. Those people knew how to position Rauner, where to put him in front of black voters. But then he was on his own. But that was a lot more, as you pointed out, than Brady did, and that most Republicans seeking office do. When you look at county offices, Republicans don't show up.
And so what do you think? Is this a lesson for Republicans for the future? Should they be, is the African American community, as Jim Edgar said years ago, is it the margin of victory? I think it's, let me clarify that and say that maybe it's unrealistic to expect a majority of African American votes, or even, let's say, a third of African American votes to go for a Republican candidate. But if you get that 20–25%, is that going to guarantee that you win as a Republican in Illinois?
Well, first of all, we shouldn't get too excited about Rauner and the black vote, because I think you had a lot of the people voting against Quinn versus for Rauner. As a friend who does a lot of political work once phrased it, the dog catcher vote. You know, no matter what this individual was running for, they'd get the vote. Well, in this case, it was as long as it wasn't Quinn, they would vote for him.
Interesting.
I don't see that that he can come back with a lot of black support. You also have to look at, you know, their previous elections before the projects were knocked down. You know, you had a way of accessing a huge number of black voters at one time, black voters who more or less thought along the same lines, just because of their environment. once those were torn down and people moved to the south suburbs or west suburbs, that kind of diluted the impact.
Right. Okay. Let's switch now from the state to the city, and before we get to the city elections, which I'm dying to talk about, let's talk about the Obama Library. Because I think it's an important issue kind of behind the scenes of what's going on in the mayor's race, and I think it's something that, well, we'll get to it, but I want to ask you if the mayor has made any missteps here. But before we get to that, let me just tell our viewers that President Obama is seeking to build his presidential library somewhere. There are bids out there, as we know, from Hawaii, from Columbia University in New York City, and from the University of Illinois in the west side, and from the University of Chicago on the south side. How do you read these different bids, and do you still think that Chicago is the number one, has the number one likelihood of getting the Obama Library?
I think it is. It does have the number one likelihood. The head of the foundation is from Chicago, Marty Nesbitt. Michelle Obama is from Chicago. The president has been adopted as a Chicagoan. And I think that those play huge factors. And of course, every media outlet right now is a homer in terms of the New York Times, New York Post, writing about all of the advantages of coming there. The Honolulu Star, I believe, or Bulletin, I can't remember right now, they're saying the same thing. I think what's hurting us is, us being Chicago, is this house divided. I've talked a few times about the possibility of having part of the library on the west side, part of the library on the south side. That wouldn't satisfy everybody who's involved in the respective committees. But personally, that would be the best thing. I talked with a professor from the Illinois Institute of Technology, Marshall Brown, who has studied presidential libraries, and he led me to some very interesting facts. One is that a presidential library isn't like the Grand Crossing Library or the Harold Washington Library, one structure doing one or two things. Presidential libraries are huge. They don't necessarily limit themselves to a single building or a single site. First President Bush has a library in Texas and in Maryland. There's another, I think Nixon has 2 libraries in California. So why couldn't we replicate or do that here? It goes back to this decades-long dispute about South Side versus West Side. And this, to me, was the perfect opportunity to try to put that to rest and have everyone come together and say, we can do this, as Chicago, not as the South Side of Chicago or the West Side of Chicago. And
that would have been a great way to avoid having to use public parkland for the museum, which is one of the items that the University of Chicago has proposed, which I'm guessing is also an issue.
It is, and what the mayor is doing in terms of trying to convey parkland, and the Friends of the Park have legitimate complaints that they've worked to preserve our parks, and for forever people have had their preference for how they use the parks, whether it's just to hang out or have a picnic or sit around and drink beer, whatever they do. The parks represent a certain way of life in the city, and even a sliver of parkland used for this kind of building is going to change that dynamic greatly.
That is a great point to seg into the mayor's race and into the citywide elections. Is the proposal with the Obama Library is it one of the missteps that the mayor has made with the African American community? I'm talking about Mayor Rahm Emanuel, of course, who's facing a number of challengers on February 24th in the citywide election. It seems strange to me, and I'll explain my question. It seems strange to me that the proposal would come into the White House in the way that it did, without having the parks commit land that for a proposal. And I'll just say, again, just to turn to the mayor's race a little bit more, do you see this as part of a pattern of Mayor Emanuel messing up when it comes to the African American community? I can't think of a neater way to say it.
Yeah, it's part of a pattern. The mayor seems to just be, wadding up toilet paper, putting it on the sink and throwing it against the wall to see what sticks. Because, closing the schools, that you can't fix that.
Explain that a little bit, in case anyone hasn't been paying attention to Chicago politics the last 3 years.
Okay, the mayor decided that 50 Chicago public schools needed to be closed. The vast majority of them were in the African American community, and the verdict is out on whether the promises that were made with the school closings actually have become a reality. There was a story in the Tribune, I think yesterday, and on a report that Dick Simpson did from University of Illinois Chicago, and it's by and large inconclusive that all of these kids tens of thousands of kids who were moved are doing better academically or even socially. And people in the African American community held demonstrations, they pleaded, they did their own reports, even had kids making presentations as to don't close our schools. And the mayor and the superintendent of schools pretty much ignored it. And the city hasn't realized, or the district hasn't realized, the cost savings that was promised. And it's just been a huge boondoggle.
The African American community, depending on the year, in a citywide election, is between 43 and 54% of the electorate. Right? If President Obama's on the ballot, or historically speaking, Harold Washington is on the ballot, African American turnout goes up, and African Americans can almost have a majority of the votes in the city all on their own, or historically did. As you scan through the challengers to Mayor Emanuel, we've got Willie Wilson, a businessman and a McDonald's franchise owner. Former McDonald's franchise owner. We've got Jesus Garcia, a Cook County commissioner. And we've got Bob Fioretti, an alderman from a ward that is being redistricted out of existence. As you look at those three candidates, and others that may be out there, do you see anyone that can capture that African American electorate and eliminate Mayor Emanuel in his bid for re-election?
Right now, that's a very tough call. Willie Wilson is getting traction. I think, though, it's more traction with the media than it is with the voters, because he's got this hard scrabble story of picking cotton in Louisiana and becoming a multi-millionaire, which, is great for movies, but it doesn't fix the budget in Chicago. There was Mark Brown from the Sun-Times did a couple of columns this week, and the second one, he was with Mr. Wilson at his campaign office, and Mr. Wilson's team was trying to get him to prepare for an upcoming mayoral debate, and he said he didn't need to. And that was just, I had to read that twice. That was just unbelievable.
Sure.
That this high stakes position you're going after, and you've never held public office, but you want to determine how you're going to interact with these guys who have some experience at it. It was It was unbelievable. And Chuy Garcia has, I think his big misstep has been playing to his base too much, and that's Hispanic voters. When he announced, I was excited about it. I saw him as the person who could bring the African American and the Latino communities together in some sort of block. But so many of the black people I've talked to, West Side, South Side, they're just not feeling Chuy. Mm-hmm. They don't think he's made an effort to reach out, as well as he's too much of the daily type machine. And then Bob Fioretti, I'm really shocked that Bob isn't gaining more traction, that he's not resonating more with voters, and I think that has a lot to do with the ability to raise money. And it's a very tough thing to raise money against this mayor.
Who, of course, has about $13 million in his
It seems like it grows by the day,
It
by the millions by the day, yeah.
Seems like it does.
Yeah, I don't know that amount of money is not impossible to compete with if you've got the right message and the right outreach. But I think that we don't have an opponent for the mayor who has put those things together.
So we're winding down. We're in our last few seconds of the show. So let me ask for your prediction. What's going to happen on February 24th? Will Mayor Emanuel, as most of our viewers probably know, this was a runoff election, so if Mayor Emanuel or another candidate does not get 50% of the vote plus one, there will be a runoff. What's your prediction? Will we go to a runoff, or will Mayor Emanuel take it?
I think we'll go to a runoff.
That's exciting, because that's something that I don't think we've seen in a while.
No, we haven't.
Do you think that'll be? Do you think there's a chance for things to turn around, or do you think in the end Mayor Emanuel will be reelected?
Probably reelected in the end. A lot depends on the two candidates who don't make it, how much they're willing to support the one who does.
Great. And in just a few seconds, why don't you tell me about one of the other candidates that's lying out there, William Doc Walls, who seems to have a lot of social media presence. Is Doc Walls going to be a force in this campaign?
I think not.
I think not. Okay.
Yeah, Doc has a lot of social media presence. If we could just move back to a second regarding the debate and Willie Wilson, I think that of everybody who's running, Doc is the best presenter. He is the best debater. And so a guy who's not terribly articulate like Willie Wilson is going to have an extremely tough time in a debate with Doc. But Doc just doesn't resonate with voters. I mean, in the last election in '07, he trotted out this nanotechnology platform, and so many people, including yours truly, what is he talking about?
Well, great. That's a good note to end. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom, a community service of CAN TV. Of course, you can find us here on cable, but you can see us anytime at this address below. Check us out there or subscribe through iTunes. I'm Eitan Michaeli. Thank you for joining us.